Hey good friends, it's me, Mary. In this video I'm going to be reviewing The Lying Detective, which is episode 2 of season 4. Before I start all that, I just want to thank you for anyone who sent good vibes into the universe about my cat. She is doing much better. The type of cancer she has is very treatable and we're starting her on her chemotherapy today. However, I think I paid in karma for this outcome in this terrible... Can I say terrible? I know, I want to say it's like kind of like where you disguise breadcrumbs as a feast and hope no one will notice. I feel like it was very much a very dark episode. And there were some nice moments in the episodes, such as Sherlock writing the words F off. I don't like swearing, sorry. When he knows Mycroft is watching him. I really loved the introduction with Toby Jones. Toby Jones as a villain was very good. I've always liked his work as a villain ever since I saw him as the Dream Lord in Doctor Who. Unfortunately, I think he's a villain that was slightly wasted. The ambiguity of Sherlock's narration in the episode as an unreliable narrator, someone who's high, didn't work to actually make Toby Jones more scary. It actually made him less scary because you discredited any of his wrongdoings as Sherlock's paranoia, and even at the end it was already sort of planned out in a way that made you realise that no matter what was going to happen, John was going to save Sherlock anyway, and so really Toby Jones was not that much of a threat. The second thing I liked about this episode, I'm going to try and find things I liked about it. I did like the chemistry between Benedict and the woman who plays Faith, whose name temporarily escapes me. Just give me a moment. Gina Bramhill. I really loved her chemistry with Benedict. It was a very comfortable chemistry, which is not something that Benedict has with a lot of actors, even Martin. He's a very good actor at creating tension. I think it's simply because he has a very strong presence. But his performance with Faith, Sherlock, was doing something that I thought was kind of out of character, but it worked because their chemistry was really nice. Ultimately though, what I want to talk about is how the unreliable narrator shows the insecurities of the writing. The first thing that irked me about this episode was its very intense references to drug abuse and suicide and the way it sort of handled those. I have very personal issues with those topics. Unless you've experienced that or you've talked to someone who's experienced, I don't think it's something that you should write about. In comparison to Elementary, which always treats Sherlock's addiction with the utmost apprehension and concern, John and Molly and everyone else sort of goes, oh, he's at it again. It's often treated like a joke, and for me it's a joke that is not very funny, although I did like that we saw Billy. I liked Billy Wiggins as a character, and also he's from the original stories as the leader of Holmes's Baker Street irregulars. But I didn't very much like the way that the suicidal stuff was handled, particularly a line which everyone seems to really like: your life isn't your own, so keep your hands off it. I think that feeds into the whole thing that like suicide is an act of murder. It's something you often hear as someone who is suicidal, that you can't do this because of how I feel, putting other people's feelings before how the actual victim feels. Everybody in the show blames Sherlock for his drug use. No one actually asks him why he's doing it, or everyone's sort of very confrontational about it. And in the meantime, he runs around sort of making a joke out of the fact that he's got so many drugs in his system that he will die in a matter of weeks. It's very insensitive to people who have experienced those struggles, and I personally had to stop the episode about halfway through because it was quite difficult for me to watch. Next thing I want to talk about is the apparition of Mary, which wasn't technically Mary, it's John's projection of Mary. Men tend to idolize women into what they want them to be. So Mary is very submissive, sort of telling John what he wants to hear, even though he acts like he doesn't want to hear it. As I've said a million times, I love the women of Sherlock. They are very important to me, and I love how Mrs. Hudson shoved Sherlock in the boot of the Aston Martin, though it sort of falls under that whole humorizing drug abuse and suicidal tendencies. Benedict's performance in The Lying Detective was sensational. There was a big range of emotions there, very much like his performance in His Last Vow. I think The Lying Detective has gone beyond that, particularly when you watch that scene where he's quoting, I think it's Hamlet, I'm not quite sure, running around with a gun. It's hard though to balance that again with that idea of making a joke out of a very serious problem that Sherlock has. It's revealed that Mary actually asked him to do this, or at least she asked him to let John save him, and that meant that he had to overdose and go all a bit nuts. That whole scenario is something so toxic, I can't believe that it was actually considered a legitimate plotline. The idea that John Watson needs to be able to save people. I feel like John Watson is not only like an adrenaline junkie now, he has been framed as a man who is only a doctor because he enjoys the power that it gives him over people, and he enjoys having that. And the idea that Mary knew this and wanted Sherlock to put himself in some kind of fatal scenario so that John would come in and save him. John can only be friends with Sherlock as long as Sherlock needs saving. That's not what friendship is. Sadism is where you enjoy others' pain, and I feel like John is now being framed as a sadist, which is why I don't like him very much. I was already feeling icky from being triggered by the first parts of the episode, and then I felt icky because of that reveal. And then the last scene has Sherlock and John in Baker Street chilling out. The apparition of Mary is there, more or less to validate whatever John says to us as an audience. Sherlock's phone goes off and it's Irene Adler's text alert. I actually wrote a little thing about it. While I give props to Moffat for getting John to acknowledge the relationship between Sherlock and Irene Adler, the acknowledgement is executed in a way that gives it as little significance as possible. The acknowledgement follows swiftly after the text alert, which Sherlock ignores and admits he rarely, if ever, responds. The notion that Sherlock texts Irene Adler prompts John's confession that he cheated on Mary in the form of texting random bus lady. He also confesses that he wished he'd done more than text his mistress and encourages Sherlock to do the same with Irene. How this exchange is well intended, but it ultimately falls short of what it's trying to achieve. By the end of the scene, you still have two men who have essentially bonded over how they have emotionally neglected their respective love interests, making their hug an act of comfort and framing them as the victims in these scenarios, despite the fact that it is mostly the women who have paid the price. And Stephen Moffat might have gotten away with this if he followed it up with a scene where John and Sherlock acknowledge how their behaviours have hurt these women without framing it in the context of their own pain. Something along the lines of, I disrupted Irene Adler's life, I shouldn't just ignore her because that's an awful thing to do. But this is not what happens. Instead, we get a vague comment about how it's bad to text Irene while an apparition of Mary encourages the men with a grin. By the end of the scene, Sherlock excuses his and John's emotional negligence with a classic gaslighting quip of "we're all human." Queerbaiting only thrives in misogynistic scenarios like these, where two men and their friendship is prioritised over the feelings of female characters, even when those female characters are at the heart of their conversation. While it may seem romantic on the surface, what's actually happening is Irene, Mary, and even the random buswoman are used as buffers to keep anything romantic from happening between the two men. So literally just like no homo. Moffat has Irene's text go off so that we, the audience, know that Sherlock is still emotionally attached to her before he hugs John. Equally, the whole reason Sherlock hugs John is because he's crying over Mary's death. But in case you're still in doubt of their lack of any specifically gay romantic feelings toward each other, Moffat makes sure that both John and Sherlock see Mary as a hallucination, while Sherlock name drops Irene following the scene. So in this way, that scene was absolutely a mess for me, because instead of advancing the story with Irene, Moffat and Gaddis want John and Sherlock to have one foot in each camp. That is queerbaiting and misogyny at its finest. When the text went off and John sort of went, it means it's your birthday. That's such a big reach. If Irene Adler was alive, this would be the only day you could text him on New Year's or Orthodox Easter or friggin' St. Patrick's Day. So why was that a logical assumption? I wasn't a big fan of the plot of the episode. Moffat and Gaddis leaned on the unreliable narrator to the point where I didn't actually care for the plot and more just cared for the moment when Sherlock would have clarity enough to tell us what was going on. More and more the series is showing its blatant disregard for women, and also its blatant disregard for the canon of their own writing. Have Mycroft sort of say that he doesn't believe in showing emotion and he sees all people as goldfish, and then to imply that he's hooking up with Lady Smallwood. That was the most surreal part, and this brings me to my final roast for the episode. There are very few tropes in this world that I genuinely hate. Basically, if you put this in your story, I will stop watching. The secret sibling trope. I hate this trope because it is a cheap trope. It is something that is only ever used when writers are desperate. The reveal of the third home sibling was tacky. The idea that Sherlock wouldn't recognize his own relative. The idea that his parents would never have mentioned it. It's rather ridiculous. Rather ridiculous. All I can think of is Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat going, oh, we've already given them 3 good seasons. We'll just make this a whole sort of fan service thing with the most basic plot. We'll kill off Mary because she's made things too happy around here. And we'll chuck in like the third home sibling, which is not actually a thing in the Arthur Conan Doyle stories, so it makes us look pretty stupid for justifying Mary's death in terms of the canon. It's really showing that Moffat and Gatiss don't care about this story or these characters anymore. We killed Moriarty, we married John off, we have reached a point where obviously the characters are going to be stagnant, so let's kill Mary, introduce a secret sibling, and have Sherlock go off the rails. The Lying Detective, is it as bad as The Sixth Thatcher? No, it's worse. I will say one thing though that I like about this season is lots of Holmes brothers interaction. Mycroft and Sherlock, the most interesting relationship in this show. It's the one that sort of stayed true to what it is. The unreliable narrator is really hard to get right, and a lot of writers use the unreliable narrator as a way to cover up things that they haven't actually done. By including the unreliable narration of Sherlock because he's using drugs, he's not in the right place emotionally, it's easy to justify Sherlock not being able to recognise her. Of course Sherlock wouldn't recognise her, he was high on drugs. It means that Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat can be sloppy, and it's easy to excuse. It's easy to discredit any mistakes, also easy to miscredit anything that you see, which is helpful when you don't want to portray John and Sherlock as romantic, but nor do you want to get rid of that potential. The unreliable narrator is a very dangerous tool to use, and it's usually abused. And this unfortunately is an episode where it was very much abused, along with the sensitivity of the issues that they were dealing with and the secret sibling trope. This is all very big sign that Mark and Stephen are tired of this show. The characters seem tired, the writing seems tired, and I'm just very uninterested in a story that's going to go down this path. Anyway, I'll see you guys after the final problem, as in the finale of Sherlock, possibly the grand finale, which hopefully we'll see Moriarty in there. Bye.